Hey everyone, welcome back to Programming Fields. I'm your host Umesh Rana. In the last video, we saw that how we can create a secure form in Laravel using Laravel form validation technique. In today's video, we are going to learn a very important aspect of web development, that is Laravel form requests. Before we jump into the Laravel form requests, let's quickly talk about why form validation is so important. So the form validation is key to ensure the integrity of user input in any web applications. User input can be unpredictable, and without proper validation, your application is vulnerable to errors and there can be security issues. But nothing to worry. Laravel comes to the rescue with a powerful tool known as form request. These make handling form validation a breeze, keeping your code clean and your controller focused on what they do best. And the benefits of using form request in Laravel is it helps you centralize your validation logic, and it will make it easier to manage and reuse your code. So the first question that will come in your mind, like what exactly are form requests in Laravel? So form requests are specialized classes designed to handle the validation logic for incoming requests. They are not just about validation, they are just a Laravel recommendation way to encapsulate request, validation and authorization together. Now let's talk about why you should use form requests. The form requests help you organize your validation logic outside of your controllers, and it will make them more readable and maintainable. Moreover, form requests contribute to cleaner controllers by offloading validation concerns to dedicated classes. That means your controllers can focus on their primary purposes for managing the application's business logic only. So now let's jump into the practical, in which we will see how do we set up a form request class in Laravel. So I'm navigated to the terminal and open the project in VS Code editor. So in the last video, we have created a form, and along with the validation, so we have customized the error messages and populated the old values to the form. Alright, if I will run the application, then we had this result, just like we had a form, and on submit this was triggering this validation error message. So if I will navigate to the controller, then here in this store function we had created this form validation rule and along with the custom error messages. Also in the form we had captured those error messages. So this was done. Now we will create the form request. So in order to create the form request, simply navigate to the terminal, and here we will type php artisan make request, and we'll have to provide the request name as registration request. If I will hit enter, then you can see here this created one file inside http requests directory. Okay, so let's navigate to that file. So here inside app there is http, and inside http we have requests folder. Inside request we have created this registration request. So basically this form request will be triggered automatically before submitting any form. Alright, so here we have created this registration request. When we will submit this form, I want to trigger that request first. So based on that, we will add validation rules here instead of writing in this controller. So by using this way, our controller will be more cleaned and our code will be more optimized. Alright, so inside this form request, we can handle validation rules, and also we can define custom messages. So here you will see this imported through Illuminate, Foundation, HTTP and form request. So this is the core feature of Laravel framework. Here if you will see, there is one function named authorize. So this authorize function will determine if the user is authorized, means if user is logged in, then will allow this particular request to be handled. Okay, so by default it is throwing false. If user is not authorized, it won't allow to access this particular request. Alright, and if you will scroll down, then here you will see there is one function that is called rules. So Laravel by default handles all the validation things using this rules function. So inside this rules we can define validation rules, and accordingly we will have to bind this form request with the user controller submit function. Okay, so by default in this controller store function, this eliminate request is called. So instead of that, we will call that form request, and based on that we will define all the validation things here. So for better understanding, we can simply navigate to this file. So you will find this file inside vendor folder. So if you navigate to vendor, and here inside this we have Laravel folder, Now navigate to framework, and there is src illuminate. So if we will navigate here, then inside this foundation, because this path is located inside illuminate foundation, so inside foundation we have http folder, and there you will see form request. Inside this form request, all the validation things are already defined. If you will see validator facade rules, if you will search for rules, all the validation rule things here. Also regarding message, just like we define custom messages, so those things are already defined here. Okay, and this is already imported inside this form request, because this class is inherited with that form request class. So now let's quickly add the validation rules here. We will simply navigate to the our controller, and from here I will just copy all these validation rules which are defined inside this controller function. So I will simply cut it from here, and then I will paste inside this array. Okay, so the validation rules are defined inside this registration form request. Now we can simply comment this code as of now. Now switch back to browser. Let me refresh it, and if I will submit, then our form is submitted. Okay, so now let's switch back to controller. Instead of this illuminate http request, we will call our this registration request. Okay, so let's import that first, registration request. Okay, so we have called that registration request instead of this normal http request. Okay, so now all the validation rules related things will be triggered from here. Okay, now let's save it, switch back to browser. Let me go back. If I will refresh it, now let me submit this. So now you can see this thrown 403, that is unauthorized access. Okay, so this is clearly saying this action is unauthorized. It means we are not allowed to perform this action without authorization. Okay, so let's switch back to code. And here this function, as we discussed, this is for authorization check. So initially whenever this form request is triggering, this authorize function is calling up automatically. So here it checks if the user is authorized, then it will allow, else it will return false. Okay, so as of now we have not created any auth related things, so we will simply make it true as of now, so that if user is not authorized, then also it will allow to trigger this action. Now let's switch back to browser, and let me zoom it out. Okay, refresh it. Now if I will submit, then you can see this triggered the validation. Okay, and all the validation rules are automatically fired up here with the default message. So these all messages are the default messages that coming through this input name. All right, now let's customize this messages again. We already created our customized messages here in this controller. We will simply copy all these things, and now again we will come to this registration request. Here we will create one function, public function messages. So this messages function is already defined inside this form request. Okay, so from here we are just going to override that message, and we will pass custom error messages from here. So what we will do, we will simply return one array just like this, and inside this array we will pass those customized error messages. Okay, that's it. Now if we will come back to browser, refresh it, and now let's try to submit. So now you can see this triggered our customized error messages. Okay, so now related to every form submission request, everything will work from this registration request, and here your code will be completely cleaned up. Okay, so if the form is validated, then we can simply print all these submitted requests. So let's switch back to browser, refresh it. Now let me fill up the form. Okay, and here I will just, okay, and website, that's it. Now let me submit it. So when I submit it, you can see our form is submitted properly. Now let's switch back to editor, and we will understand how this is working behind the scene. So inside this form request, let's start with the first authorize function. So this authorize function is already defined inside this form request. Okay, so if we will switch back to form request and here search for authorize, so here you can see there is one function protected, that is passes authorization. Here it checks if the authorize method exists, then this will call that function, and whatever we are passing from this authorize function as false or true, that will come here, and next line it will will check if that response has authorized result, then it will simply return, else by default it will return true. So here true means it will check strictly. If that user is not authorized, it won't allow you to perform this action. So as of now we had passed this authorized as true. If we make it false, and if we'll switch back again, let me refresh it, if I will submit, then again it is saying this is not authorized. All right, now let's come to this form request, and here if we will put dump and die to $result, and now if I will resubmit it, then you can see this is coming false. All right, and this value is coming from here. So from this form request, basically we are passing values to these functions just for overriding this. So this is done. Now let's come to the next thing, that we have messages. All right, so if we will search for messages, then you can see here this messages has empty array. So whatever we will pass in the customized error messages, these messages will be automatically added here, and based on these messages it will display in the form. In the last video, we already used one form validation attribute, that was stop on first failure. Okay, for that you can simply enable or disable it from this request itself. So that attribute you will find inside, if you will search for a stop on first failure. In case if you want to override this, then you'll have to define that protected variable here. All right, just like this, protected. And from here you can simply pass this to true. For more information, we can simply navigate to this Laravel documentation, and here if you will search for form request, then scroll down, then you can see here stop on first failure. So we can define this attribute from this request itself. All right, now let's discuss one more thing. So inside this registration form request, we have created rules and messages. All right, now in some cases, if you want to modify the input attribute name, just like we have email, we have password, phone number, right? If you want to customize this attribute just for displaying purpose, because internally we will have this field as name or email just based on the form input name. All right, so in case if you want to display error messages by modifying the name attribute, then for that Laravel provides attribute function. Okay, so here you will have to create one function just like attributes. Again, this function is already defined in this form request. If you will search for this function, then here you will find this attributes, and by default it is empty array. So whatever you will pass from this attributes, it will directly change this here. Okay, so you will have to create array just like return, and inside this you will have to define the field name, just like I want this email to be printed as email address. Okay, so I will simply type email, and inside this array I will change this to email address. Okay, and again for this name, let's suppose I want this name to be printed as username, just like this. All right, so now this will override our name attribute for this particular name and email field. All right, now come to the browser. Now if I will refresh this form and if I will submit, okay, we'll have to disable this authorization. Okay, now refresh it, please enter the name. Okay, so we had defined stops on first failure, so by default it is triggering the first validation, and for the rest input it is not triggering the validation rules. All right, so let me make it false as of now. Refresh, and if I will submit, all these validation errors are triggered again, and just for the name input the customized error message is displayed but attribute is not reflecting. So in order to do that, we have to pass that attribute as a placeholder. So for every input validation error messages, here we need to replace this name with that placeholder. So instead of name here, we will write simply attribute, and same thing for this here. So again you will have to write attribute colon attribute, and just for this one, and again for this email address. Now let's save it. switch back to browser, refresh this form. Now if I will try to submit, then you can see the named attribute is replaced with the customized attributes. So let's check for other validation. If you will submit here, then you can see this reflected the customized named attribute for this particular input. Similarly for email address, if you will submit, then you can see this triggered the email address must be a valid email address. Alright. To sum it up, we saw that form requests are a game changer in Laravel development. They keep your code organized, your controllers clean, and contribute to a more maintainable application. So I encourage you to give form request a try in your next Laravel project, and your code will thank you later. So thanks for sticking around, guys. If you found this tutorial helpful, don't forget to hit this like button, share it with your fellow developers, and subscribe to our channel for more Laravel tutorials. And also, if you have any suggestion or feedback, then don't forget to leave that in the comment section. I would love to hear from you. Thank you and see you in the next video.